The wind in Laramie didn't blow so much as it attacked, whipping grit into Clara's eyes and tugging at the sensible wool of her traveling suit. She stood on the platform, a single trunk at her feet, and watched the train belch smoke as it retreated east. Back toward her sister's relieved tears and her mother's anxious fretting. In her bag, wrapped in linen, were the letters from Mr. Elias Thorne of the Wind River Ranch and a small, painted likeness of her sister Lily. Clara's plan was simple. Find the man, explain the deception, apologize for the waste of his time, and, if her meager savings allowed, board the next train home. A man stood apart from the bustling crowd of drovers and drummers, his stillness more noticeable than any movement. He was tall, his frame lean and hardened like sun-bleached timber. His face was all angles under the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, and his eyes, when they finally landed on her, were the color of a winter creek. He held no sign, but he looked at her with a directness that felt like a summons. Clara lifted her chin, gripped her bag, and walked toward him. "Mr. Thorne?" He gave a single, slow nod. His gaze swept over her, not with a suitor's appraisal, but with a rancher's assessment. It lingered on her hands, clasped tightly on the bag's handle, hands that were strong, with short, practical nails and a faded scar across the right knuckle from a sewing awl. "You're not her," he said. His voice was low, roughened by weather and disuse. The prepared speech died in Clara's throat. "No, sir. I am Clara Vance. Lily is my sister." The journey, the idea of it all. She found she couldn't. "I've come to explain, and to return her letters and portrait." She fumbled for the linen packet. He didn't reach for it. "The brooch," he said. "In her last letter, she described a cameo brooch, her mother's. Said she'd be wearing it." Clara's free hand went instinctively to her collar, where the simple carved shell was pinned. Lily had pressed it into her hand at the station. "For luck," she'd whispered. A cold understanding began to seep into Clara's bones. Elias Thorne's eyes tracked the movement. "She described you," he stated, the pieces clicking into place with a quiet, terrible logic. "The steadiness, the way she relied on you. She wrote about your hands, always working." "Mr. Thorne, please. My sister is young and romantic. She meant no harm." "I am here only to—" "You look like you can work," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for her unfinished sentence. He looked past her, toward the vast, tawny plains that rolled into distant blue mountains. "I've wasted a week coming to fetch a bride. I need a partner. The house is too much for May alone. The ranch ledgers are a mess. I need someone who won't faint at the sight of a butchering, who can ride if they have to." His eyes cut back to her. "You're here. You're clearly not the fainting type. I'll take you." The words were so blunt they stole the air from her lungs. It wasn't a proposal. It was a business proposition, stark and unadorned as the landscape around them. The part of Clara that had spent a lifetime being useful, the part that measured her worth in tasks completed and problems solved, heard the grim logic in it. The rest of her, the buried part that had sometimes dreamed of a kind word, a gentle touch, recoiled. You would marry a stranger, knowing it's a deception?" "The letters were with a stranger," he said. "At least now I know what I'm getting. A month's trial. You work as housekeeper. We see if it suits. If not, I'll pay your fare back east when the supply wagon goes to Cheyenne in the fall." Fall was months away. Clara calculated the pitiful few dollars in her purse. The debt back home her presence was no longer needed to manage. She was stranded, as effectively as if she'd been marooned on an island. She looked at this hardened man, at the unyielding land he called home, and did the only thing her practicality would allow. "A month," she agreed, her voice as steady as she could make it. "As your employee, nothing more." Another nod. He hefted her trunk onto his shoulder as if it were empty and turned toward a waiting wagon. The Wind River Ranch was a 2-day journey from the railhead, a silent trip where the only sounds were the creak of harness leather, the sigh of the wind, and the distant cries of hawks. The ranch house, when it finally appeared, was a long, low structure of peeled logs, crouched against a stand of pines as if for protection. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress that had settled into the earth. May, the cook and housekeeper, met them at the door. She was a woman of few smiles and observant eyes, her dark hair streaked with silver and tied in a severe knot. She took one look at Clara, then at Elias's set face, and seemed to understand the entire situation without a word being spoken. "The spare room's aired out," was all she said, leading Clara inside. The house was clean but barren of comfort. The furniture was sturdy and plain. There were no curtains, only shutters. No pictures on the walls, but a fine layer of dust on a high shelf where something small might once have sat. The air held the faint, cold scent of old ashes and loneliness. Clara's trial began at dawn. May showed her the kitchen, the pantry, the relentless routine. There was bread to bake, not in a single loaf but in batches that could feed a dozen hungry men. There was washing, done in a huge copper kettle over a fire in the yard. There was mending, piles of it, denim and flannel torn by wire and labor. Elias was a ghost in his own home. He left before first light and returned after dark, smelling of horse, sweat, and cold air. Meals were silent affairs, eaten quickly. He spoke to her only to give instructions. "The accounts book is on the desk in my study. The figures from the last cattle drive need tallying." Or, "May says you can sew. The bunkhouse men have a heap of torn shirts." Clara worked. It was the language she understood best. She organized the chaotic ledgers, her neat rows of numbers, a quiet rebellion against the disorder. She patched the shirts with stitches so small and strong they were nearly invisible. She learned to bake May's sourdough, to keep the fire at just the right pitch. She felt Elias's eyes on her sometimes, that same assessing look, but he said nothing. The first crack in the ice came from the outside. A rider came pounding into the yard one afternoon, his face pale under the grime. It was the homesteader from the North Quarter. His boy was burning up with fever, and his wife was beside herself. Could Mrs. Thorne come? He stammered, realizing his error, looking desperately at May. Clara was already moving. "I'm not a doctor," she said, washing her hands, "but I've nursed fevers." She packed a basket with clean cloths, a bottle of willow bark tonic from May's stores, and a jar of broth. Elias appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "It's a 3-hour ride." "The weather's turning." "All the more reason to hurry," Clara said, pulling on her sister's discarded cloak, which was too fine for this but all she had. He didn't argue. He simply saddled 2 horses. They rode in silence, the sky darkening to the west like a bruise. At the homestead, a single-room cabin thick with fear, Clara took charge with a calm that surprised even her. She cooled the boy with damp cloths, spooned the tonic into him, and spoke in a low, steady voice to the terrified mother. Elias, wordless, brought in more wood, fixed a hinge on the door that had been banging in the wind, and held the father's shoulder for a moment when the man's hands wouldn't stop shaking. The storm hit as they began the ride back. It wasn't snow, but a cold, lashing rain that turned the trail to slick mud. The wind howled, tearing at their clothes. Clara's fine cloak was soon soaked through, dragging at her shoulders. Her horse, spooked by a sudden crack of thunder, shied violently. Clara felt her balance go, a sickening lurch into the dark and the mud. A strong hand closed around her arm, hauling her back into the saddle before she'd even registered the fall. Elias had his horse pressed close, his grip iron. "Steady," he said, the word ripped away by the wind. He didn't let go until her reins were firmly in her hands again. They rode the rest of the way, pressed knee to knee for stability. A solid, silent bulwark against the raging night. Back at the ranch, dripping in the kitchen by the stove, the world had shrunk to the circle of lamplight and the sound of their breathing. May had left a pot of coffee warming. Elias poured 2 cups, pushed one toward her. His hand, she noticed, was nicked with fresh cuts from the wire he'd been mending that morning. "The boy?" he asked, his first unprompted question in days. "The fever broke just before we left. He'll be weak, but he'll live." He nodded, staring into his cup. "You did well." It was the closest thing to praise she'd heard from him. It wasn't about her baking or her sewing. It was about staying calm in the storm, about being useful where it mattered most. The next week, a letter came from Lily. Her sister's looping, exuberant script filled the page with news of a new beau, a clerk in her father's old firm, of picnics and promises. "I am so happy, Clara," she wrote. "And I am so endlessly grateful to you. I know you will find your own happiness. You are so much stronger than I." Clara read it by her window, watching the afternoon light gild the distant peaks. The words that were meant to absolve her only carved out the hollow space inside her. She was happy for Lily, truly. But the letter was a door closing, locking her out of the only life she'd known. She was adrift here, in this beautiful, brutal place, a substitute for a dream that had never been hers. She didn't hear Elias come in. He stood in the doorway of the parlor, holding a broken harness strap. He saw the letter in her hand, the quiet stillness of her profile against the glass. "News from home?" he asked. "My sister is engaged," Clara said, her voice carefully even. "To a man back east. She's very happy." Elias was silent for a long moment. He didn't offer congratulations. Instead, he walked to the empty hearth and leaned against the stone mantel, looking at the cold ashes. "My wife, Sarah," he said, the name strange and soft in his mouth. "She was from Philadelphia, came out here with notions of wildflowers and sunsets. The first winter, the loneliness of it, it ate at her. Then the fever took her and the baby, both in 1 week. He spoke to the ashes, not to her. I wrote those letters to your sister wanting someone soft. Someone to make this place feel less like an outpost. But soft things don't last out here. They break." Clara turned from the window. "And you think I won't break?" He finally looked at her, his gaze clear and heavy. "I think you already know how to carry the weight. I saw it the moment you stepped off that train. You weren't looking for a rescue. You were looking at the problem, figuring the cost." He paused. "That's what this place is. A beautiful, relentless problem. It needs someone who won't romanticize it, someone who will just do the work." It was the most he'd ever said to her. In his bleak honesty, Clara felt a perverse kind of respect. He wasn't offering her fairy tales. He was offering her the truth, as hard and plain as the log walls around them. The final test came with the first real snow. It started as flurries, then thickened into a blinding, howling blizzard that screamed down from the mountains. The cattle, panicked by the whiteout, began to drift toward the treacherous draws. If they piled up in there, the ranch would be ruined. Clara was bundling into every layer she owned when Elias appeared in the kitchen, his face grim. "I need every hand. Even May's riding out. You'll have to come. Can you stay on a horse in this?" Quote, "I can try," she said. What followed was an hours-long battle against the cold and the chaos. The world reduced to a wall of white, the desperate bawling of cattle, and the shadowy forms of men and horses. Clara's job was to help hold the line, to turn the lead cows back from the draws. The cold was a living thing, biting through wool and leather, stealing the breath from her lungs. Her hands went numb on the reins. Her face felt carved from stone. She lost sight of Elias, then saw him through a temporary rift in the snow, a dark figure fighting to turn a massive steer alone. His horse slipped on the ice-hidden slope. For a heart-stopping moment, man and beast went down in a tangle. Clara didn't think. She kicked her own horse forward, riding into the blur, dismounting before she'd fully stopped. The steer lumbered away, confused. Elias was on his feet, his horse scrambling up, but he was favoring his left leg, his breath coming in ragged, white gasps. "Your ankle," she shouted over the wind. "It's fine," he gritted out, but when he tried to put weight on it, his knee buckled. "Get back on," she ordered, the wind whipping her words away. She made a step with her locked hands. He stared at her then, with a grunt of pain, used her boost to haul himself into the saddle. She mounted behind him, taking the reins from his stiff fingers. She could feel the tremor of exhaustion in his back, the way he leaned into her solidity. They got the cattle turned, bunched into a more sheltered valley. The other hands took over the watch. The ride back to the house was a silent, shivering pilgrimage. By the time they stumbled into the kitchen, both were crusted with snow, their lips blue with cold. May had the stove roaring. She helped peel off the frozen layers, pressed tin cups of hot, sweet tea into their hands. Elias sat heavily in a chair by the fire, his injured legs stretched out. Clara sat across from him, her own hands shaking so badly the tea sloshed. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of pine logs and the dying moan of the wind outside. The storm had burned itself out against the mountains. Elias stared into the flames, his profile etched in golden shadow. "You saved the herd today," he said, his voice hoarse. "And you probably saved me a broken neck." "It was just the work that needed doing," Clara murmured, repeating his own philosophy back to him. He shook his head slowly. "No, it's more than that." He turned to look at her, his face weary but his eyes intensely clear. "When Sarah died, I thought the heart of this place died with her. I was wrong. The heart of a place like this isn't in pretty words or gentle feelings. It's in the doing. It's in the staying. It's in showing up, again and again, in the blizzard and in the drought." He took a deep breath. "You're the strongest part of this ranch's future, Clara. Not as a replacement for her, not as a housekeeper, as a partner. If you'll have it, if you'll have me, it won't be easy, it won't be soft, but it will be true, and it will be yours." He wasn't on his knee. He was in a chair, bruised and spent, offering her not a ring, but a shared life of unglamorous toil. He was offering her a place, not just in his house, but in the relentless, beautiful problem of his world. He saw her, not her utility, but the strength that was the source of it. He was choosing her as she was. Clara looked around the room, at the sturdy walls that kept out the wind, at the fire that fought back the cold, at the man who valued truth over fantasy. She thought of the hollow space Lily's letter had opened, and she realized this was what could fill it. Not a grand passion, but a profound recognition. Not a rescue, but an alliance. She set her cup down, the clink on the table final. She met his gaze. "The south pasture fence is a disgrace. It'll need to be completely rebuilt come spring, and the kitchen needs a proper pantry, not just shelves. The cold gets in." A slow, deep change came over Elias's face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the thawing of something long frozen. It was hope, hard-won and practical. "The fences first," he agreed, his voice rough. "Then the pantry." Clara nodded. Then the pantry. She reached across the space between them, not for his hand, but for the ledger book that lay on the table beside him. Her fingers brushed his, both of them scarred, capable, cold. They didn't lace together. They simply rested there, on the open page of accounts, a point of contact, a promise. Outside, the wind had fallen silent, and the first stars were piercing the clear, cold sky over the Wind River Range.